panel. It is 10 o'clock. We'll start. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. We do have one from Councillor Bridget Rowlands. Haven't had anybody else? No? Okay, thank you. Then the next item is disclosure of personal and prejudicial interests. Is there anyone, any members online? No? Any officers? No. Okay. Next item is the prohibition of whipped votes and declarations of party whips, which is a common one on all scrutiny boards. No. The minutes of the previous meetings. Can I have agreement that they're a true and accurate record? Okay. Thanks, Linda and Paxton. Right. Public questions that we have none today. And the next item, item 6 on the agenda, is review of revenue reserves. And I welcome Mr. Ben Smith, Director of Finance, and apologies from Councillor Rob Stewart, who can't make it. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very brief, given you had my advice at Council and will have all have heard it. I remind you that the advice I gave to Council was that this report was relatively boring in one sense in terms of its recommendations around allocating between reserves, and reminded you that perhaps of more importance was the overall value of those reserves and what may happen at year-end outturn. So I draw your attention to the main matters, which are in the main table in section 2, which reminds you that the authority has a general fund balance of £10 million and remains relatively light compared to most other authorities in Wales. It would last about a week, and that is our, in a bad balance situation, it would last about a week's worth of spend. It's our final safety net if everything else is exhausted. But the reason they're so relatively low is because of the scale of earmarked revenue reserves at £158 million. And I would remind you that over the last 3 years, we have had relatively benign financial circumstances, which has enabled at outturn £100 million to be added to those reserves. Sounds impressively large, but as you're aware from the advice I've given to Cabinet at first quarter, and you will all be aware of what's happening in the wider UK PLC, all functions and services are under pressure, and you can expect some significant draws from reserves in the current year. I emphasise that table because it is a very substantial amount of usable cash-backed reserves and does provide a significant degree of resilience for the authority. As I said in my opening gambit, if I draw your attention then to section 3.11, the decision at Council was to allocate only the one reserve switch between contingency and the ICT Development Fund, which has been subject, which is used to fund Oracle developments, has been subject to separate scrutiny, review and feedback to Cabinet. In terms of that table, you can see the size of reserves, and it will become as no surprise that whilst I can't tell you the second quarter position because it's not been to Cabinet yet, given that the pay award has been settled and remains unfunded, the position and advice I gave at Q1 to Cabinet is likely to hold, which means there will be a significant draw planned from the recovery fund, significant draws from contingency sums and central inflation provisions. And to add to that, you can also expect a significant anticipated draw from schools' delegated reserves. So whilst reserves are substantial, and whilst there is a clear narrative and trail of planned draws from reserves, it's the burn rate going forward that will be of particular concern and is highlighted in the report in terms of section 4.5, which indicates that a fundamental part of budget setting for 23-24, given the financial difficulties that we all face and the uncertainties of what will flow from the national autumn budget statement and the relative lateness yet again of Welsh Government settlement, because that flows from that, what flows through ultimately through into the 23-24 budget. I don't think there's anything else I need to draw your attention to, Chair, and as I say, all members would have heard that advice at Council, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Is there, I should imagine there are quite a number of questions. Can I see if anybody online got any questions? No? Anyone in? Okay. I've got a couple of questions, Ben, to start off with. In the table 211, or 311, sorry, we have insurance at 17 million, 17.1. And then we have equalisation reserve 14 and the recovery fund at 39. Now, given that the levels of those reserves and the one that we have, the service earmarked reserves, you anticipate a draw on that. You can't tell us what the position is at Q2. Can you give us an idea of where we are currently at this position, where how our reserves are looking? Because obviously these are a data that is quite dated now. It's probably a couple of months old. So do you know where we are currently?
I do, and I will tread carefully because I don't want to give too much away relative to the courtesy I will extend to Cabinet in due course, but it will come as no surprise. The leader did announce a pausing of future economic recovery fund activity for a short period of time, given the inflation pressures there are. But it is of no surprise that at least £20 million was planned to be committed from the economic recovery fund, and that still remains the case. You can expect a significant add to capital equalisation reserve at outturn, again because of the beneficial interest rates that we locked into at the moment, but has been noted in other sessions and meetings of Cabinet, Council, Scrutiny that there are further borrowing requirements going forward. I would anticipate possibly up to 20-25% of those reserves being burned through in the current year. I probably don't want to go into any more granular detail at this point in time. You'll recall that I gave advice to Cabinet, for those of you in attendance at first quarter, that the draw from reserves was up to about £26 million at that point in time. To be fair, predominantly that was as a result of a pre-agreed council decision in terms of draws from the Economic Recovery Fund. But that first quarter did indicate that additional draws were required from contingency on balance sheet and in-year contingency, and it was likely or alluded to and become even more strongly the case that there will be draws from schools reserves. None of you can avoid the items in the national newspapers today around the position both in Wales and England in terms of an inevitability of some draws from schools reserves. And given that the national pay award for local government has been settled and, as I say, remains unfunded, there is only one conclusion you could logically draw from that, even if I can't at this stage give you a very firm figure. But you ought to be looking at an outturn that sees those levels of reserves drawn down by 20 to 25% in a year. It gives you a scale of it. As I say, that's not materially different from what was advised to Cabinet at first quarter. It's moved slightly. I think the position in terms of schools will get more pronounced. Simply because one of the pay deals has been settled. There remains uncertainty, of course, because the teachers' pay award has yet to be agreed, and I again tread carefully. I form no view on the rights, wrongs and wherewithals of who funds what and who agrees what for individual negotiating bodies, but clearly the risks are on the upside, and whilst we're in a better position than last year, because don't forget last year's local government pay award wasn't settled until March. This one has now been settled for implementation in this month, but it does mean inevitably, with only then 4 months of the year left, as I indicated in that first quarter report to Cabinet, it's going to be incredibly difficult for directorates to bring themselves back into balance in the current year. And I did indicate a distinction I was drawing, and Cabinet supported me in that view, a distinction between those directorates that were likely to be overspent even before the pay award and those that were going to be overspent in year as a result of the pay award. What doesn't go away is that if it remains unfunded, which looks the case, and we await the national autumn budget statement, then those are based pressures which are not going to go away, and the level of draw from reserves and the burn rate is not sustainable. That should not be surprising to any of you, because I think it repeats what I've said to both Cabinet and Council. That's probably as far as I'm prepared to go, Chair, at the moment, given the second quarter won't formally go through to Cabinet until December, but you can expect no surprises given the way things are panning out nationally.
Thank you for that. So to put it in context, this is for the financial year 2021-22. So 22-23, we have no idea yet until obviously till the Welsh Government has set down what its spending commitments are, and also what our grant uplift, if any, will be. So we won't have Q4 obviously until around about May, June, maybe next year. So our outcome for the financial year 21-22 will not be known for some time. So we'll have to accept the fact that whatever is in reserves here is going to be burnt through, as you rightly say, Q2 and then possibly Q3. So by that time, we will know what our figures are for next year. So we then have an idea of what the potential, if we have any reserves left after this. Is that correct?
I'd start with the last comment, Chair. It's not that if we have any reserves left, we will. In the sense, you've got £157 million worth of earmarked usable reserves and 10 million in general reserves. There is no scenario I can envisage which would result in that all being burnt through. I've given you an indication that you should work on the basis of 20 to 25% burn through rate in the current year. You're absolutely right. We won't know that until we get to outturn, which I draw stamps as an officer around May, and would you expect to get reported through to Cabinet in July. I would say we have been remarkably accurate in our forecasting for the previous 3 benign years, where we indicated very early how much we were going to underspend and add to reserves. I have no reason to doubt the forecast, which is the unequivocally the other way this time round in terms of the relative draw from reserves. But there is no scenario where we would not still have substantial reserves, given that starting position of 10 million in general and 157 million in earmarked. Even if we were to not confirm until next July the 20-25% burn rate, you would still have a report in due course indicating there was well over £100 million in reserves. So you should take some comfort from that. Where you shouldn't take comfort is clearly the obvious counterpoint, which is that sort of burn rate is not sustainable. I would still be much happier as your Section 151 officer having that level of reserves to start with and the amount that's been added in recent years. But it's that is causing everyone in the public sector and everyone in local government to be particularly nervous. What changes the position this time is the inbuilt base pressures in terms of unfunded pay, the ineffectiveness of the energy price cap effectively for an authority such as ours, and pretty much in common with all authorities in Wales that have pre-bought their energy. It's that causes the particular concern across all authorities, Chair.
I accept that, but the school delegation reserves and also service earmarked reserves are specifically for those services, are they not? So this, I don't think it's fair to say that we as a council could use them. We could use the others. Whereas, obviously the equalisation reserve we can use, contingency we can use, and the recovery fund we could use. But school delegated reserves, is up to the individual schools how that money is spent. Is that right?
It is in practice. Legally, schools' reserves are part of the council's reserves because schools are not body corporate in their own right. But yes, that convention is the case that schools' reserves are their own, and it is right as a working assumption to set aside that they are not available to all practical intents and purposes to the wider authority. The corollary of that argument is, given that schools themselves, as I've alluded to in terms of national newspaper reporting today, are themselves undoubtedly under pressure over energy costs, pay awards, and there is only a finite amount of money in the system, it is inevitable that schools in general terms will see a significant draw from their reserves in the current year, and that will of course be consolidated back into the council's overall position. So it's right that I report on the totality of reserves including schools, but you are right to draw that distinction. Whilst in legal terms ultimately the reserves are the council's, in operating terms they are the schools. But there is an inevitability that there will be a very significant draw from schools' reserves this year. I have no doubt about that, albeit I'm even less certain about it, given that schools themselves make their own spending decisions. But one can only draw one conclusion, even at this stage in the year, that there is an inevitability over the need for there to be a significant draw from schools' reserves in year as things stand.
Thank you. Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. In that table 3.11, the £2.5 million has been moved contingency to the IT development fund. Is that Oracle related?
It is directly related to that. So the reason I moved it was because Cabinet made its decision, which required me to take that through to council, and that's the reason why I only went for the lightest of touch of changes. So yes, it reflects the one formal decision in year to move reserves around. It's exactly what it is, Councillor Black.
So given that we have nearly 4.5 million left in contingency, if that continues to burn up money, then presumably we may have to make further transfers.
I make no presumption of that at this point in time. I mean, that's speculation, of course. But clearly, given the report that's been to Cabinet, which indicates there is no other source of funding, if there were to be any funding further pressures, which I'm not saying there are, and currently that's not the working assumption. But yes, it would be an obvious candidate if there were to be any further cost pressures. But at the moment, that would be speculation on both our parts. But you're right, given the report that's been to Cabinet has indicated there are no other sources of funding, that would be a candidate source if it were to come to pass. But I'm not suggesting it is the case at this stage.
And if we were to have any capital overspends, I'm thinking, for example, the hub in Oxford Street, where would that money come from? Which particular would that come from? We don't have a capital reserve anymore.
So you're right again, Councillor Black, in terms of individual risks on individual schemes, and there are a number that are clearly going to overspend, and there will be reports coming through in due course on those. But of course, it is also the perversity that in totality, we typically underspend on capital, and that will continue to be the case, which means that I will be advising yet again that because of slippage on the capital programme as a whole, despite those real inflationary pressures, that I will make an underspend on the overall cost of financing capital and can expect to add to the capital equalisation reserve. But the point you make is a valid one, because ultimately it's slippage and those inflation costs and pressures come to bear eventually. But we are in a fortunate position that I have quite a lot of wiggle room in the short term, and ultimately overspends on capital will either be financed by further decisions on capital borrowing to come, or decisions to draw down faster the capital equalisation reserve. My officer advice will be clearly to retain the capital equalisation reserve because it smooths costs. But as you've heard and discussed and debated in Cabinet and Council before, any additional borrowing costs will be materially more expensive than any borrowing already done.
Yeah, I'm interested in this slippage on the capital schemes. Presumably, a lot of that is down to the impact of inflation on materials. Is that mostly the reason why we're getting slippage, or is it that we're just having difficulty getting these schemes through because of other issues, such as example, labour, getting contracts sorted, that sort of thing?
I think it's a range of all of those factors, Councillor Black. I mean, there are material shortages, there are labour shortages. So you have got the perverse situation of individual unit price inflation quite marked in a number of contracts, as you're aware of, and which are coming through. But at the same time, the totality of the programme, which remains a large and challenging one, means that I still tend to be able to operate with some degree of slippage. And so in the short term, which ends up being every year short term, so therefore rolls into the medium term, which provides quite a lot of wiggle room on that capital financing element of the revenue budget. You know, when I turn up wearing a slightly different hat when it comes to revenue monitoring and then revenue outturn, I will gleefully rub my hands around the level of capital overall underspending. But you're right to make the point, because ultimately it will have to be paid eventually. It's a bit like some of the wider national debate which we had around who's paying for COVID lockdown in the years to come, and some of the ripple effects we're seeing at the moment in terms of disruption in supply chains, the inflationary pressures are due to a multitude of factors. I won't go into the detail on that, but part of it is still the ongoing convulsions of the economy shutting down, then reopening up like it did across the globe. So I think you're right to make that point, Councillor Black.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, so no. Apologies for being late, and I probably missed quite a lot of information. Yeah, it's actually on the capital equalisation reserve, 3.12. It's actually saying that the recovery fund is less likely to receive top-ups in the future, so it's really committed. You actually mentioned when I came in that we're actually going to borrow more money again. The capital equalisation reserve is actually used to fund the, shall we say, the borrowings, the charges on borrowings. how are we actually going to meet those future charges? And considering the MRP is actually coming to, shall we say, a negative conclusion really in the next couple of years, how are we going to meet these additional charges from that fund if it's already exhausted or committed?
So I'll perhaps answer some elements of that and steer away from others in to some extent. So the reason I'm making that bold assertion, which is that the Economic Recovery Fund will be drawn down, is simply because of the number of commitments that have already been made, albeit the leader did announce in his announcements at council there would be a pausing of further use of the ERF to provide some protection around the budget position for 23-24. The capital equalisation reserve will in the current year still be definitively able to be added to, in my judgment view, simply because of the slippage and also the beneficial rates we've already borrowed at. You are right, I've indicated that there is a mix and a balance to be struck. There are obligations as a result of that MRP review on that capital equalisation reserve, which means whilst it can be used in the very short term, it is ultimately necessary that if there is to be additional capital spending, that it should be borrowed and funded predominantly again through revenue. Now that gets into the realms of speculating around what the 23-24 budget is going to be, but members will be aware there have been a number of reports, some exempt in terms of their commercial sensitivity, where I've had to give officer advice to do some short-term draws from the capital equalisation reserve, but equally flagged up and chosen a stock phrase for all future capital decisions, saying capital decisions which require future borrowing will need ultimately to fall on a revenue account and will go into that mix of things that are difficult choices to be made going forward. I've given clear advice to Cabinet on the consequences of that, and Council will ultimately have to make a decision when it comes to setting the budget next March. The reality is some of those initial decisions that Cabinet has taken I've funded from the capital equalisation reserve, because at the moment the medium-term financial plan and the capital strategy as approved by Council last March provides for no additional external borrowing. If there is a decision by Council to do further external borrowing, then there will be a cost. And the reason I'm emphasising if there is a decision to do so, the reality is it's almost inevitable. No council in the land can apply for levelling up fund bidding, cannot do match funding bids without expecting there to be further capital borrowing at some point. But I probably don't want to go any further than that at this stage. There are trade-offs and difficult choices to be made, but the reality is there are large-scale schemes. So levelling up requires an element of match funding. The Mumble CRMP scheme, which has been through to Cabinet, requires us to put match funding in, and it's only a small element of match funding, but it's a small element of match funding that will require significant additional capital borrowing, and that's new capital borrowing in due course. In the very short term, because we're cash rich and I locked away over £200 million at below 2%, I have the luxury of not having to go out to the market in the very short term, but it is inevitable that some of that borrowing will have to be done in due course. No council is just going to suddenly stop doing any capital borrowing, but I know it's a matter that Councillor Jones is particularly concerned about, and the Chair has equally raised previously. The overall affordability of the capital programme, which will be funded ultimately through revenue contributions and revenue capital financing, will be part of that decision mix for council in due course. And there's no such thing as free money. It becomes a choice around it, and so I'm treading a cautious path of identifying what the likely costs and burdens are for the authority, and it'll ultimately be a policy choice. The overall level of capital borrowing and capital financing, certainly the capital financing component of overall revenue budget, is not so large as to overly concern me. You'll be aware it's grown over time, and I've given officer advice, and previous councils have taken their decisions and made their choices on the relative merit of capital versus revenue spending. I suspect the weighing of the balances is going to get harder for all members when it comes to the debate in council chamber in due course as we progress through what is undoubtedly going to be a really difficult revenue budget setting round. But I probably can't say any more than that at the moment in terms of what the future burdens and costs will be. Simply that there will be some. It is unavoidable and inevitable. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for that. Perhaps it's a little bit of an hypothetical. We don't really know what's in the future, but we've actually got shall we say, a level of borrowing that we set out, I don't know what the table is actually, I think it was 790 million or whatever, which we were pretty close to. So can we actually extend that from the current situation? Is it an affordability level that we are, shall we say, very near to with regards to borrowing?
There's a short and a long answer to that. The short answer is the borrowing limit can always be changed by decision of council if I give officer advice that it is reasonable to do so, and council makes an appropriate choice as to the relative weight to be given to capital versus revenue spending. When you take a step back and look at the relative amount that is put into capital financing versus revenue spending, my judgment view is you are nowhere near a limit of affordability in one sense. You're talking capital financing of less than 10% of your overall budget. The comparisons aren't always valid in terms of comparing a public body versus household expenditure and such like, but that sort of level of share does not in itself as an officer concern me. What does concern me is the ability of council as a whole to weigh and make judgments about if more is spent on capital and more is borrowed and more goes into that capital financing line, given it is likely, but we are in the realms of speculation, but there isn't anyone who doesn't think that the outlook in real terms is going to be really tough for the next couple of years. It does mean that there are trade-off choices and less is available for revenue. That is a decision for Cabinet to recommend and ultimately Council to take in due course. So it could go materially further higher if Council so wished. It wouldn't, as an officer, particularly concern me. We're nowhere near a level of imbalance between the capital financing cost and core revenue spending. But I think it will ultimately come down to the appetite for councillors as a whole over what level of council tax you're prepared to consider, and what balance between capital spend and revenue you're prepared to consider, given there are going to be, it's a trite phrase, but there are going to be difficult choices. It's the phrase you keep hearing from anyone working in local government and anyone in the public sector. So but as an officer, I remain quite agnostic about the political choices that ultimately you as a whole council will make come March.
I like the word that's not agnostic. Yeah, very, very, very good, Richard. Ben, I think the question that needs to be asked now, I think, is we have the reserves, equalisation reserves, and other reserves. Why go and borrow money when we already have money in the pot to use? You know, I think that's, if it's very expensive to borrow money, we have 14 million there. If we need to borrow money, we'll say for a levelling up fund, which probably be about £3 or £4 million, or maybe more, but it wouldn't be much more. Why not use that money we have in reserves, which, you know, is, as I say, 14.5 million, instead of going borrowing money at a very expensive rate? I think that's the question that a lot of people will be asking, and I think that's deserves an answer.
So perhaps if I can come back, I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's the position I've taken as an officer, which is I do not intend, in the current uncertain times and given current very heightened interest rates, I know they've gone up and then they've dropped down a bit, it will still be my intention to work through cash balances and the borrowed sums that we've already taken and potentially those reserves before I formally go back out. There is a distinction to be made between cash and resource cover. So I normally talk about cash, and we are very cash rich. I then talk about resource cover, and ordinarily when I'm referencing that, it's about the revenue cover. But you're right, Chair, there is also that bit around capital cover. So to try and cut to the chase, the reality is if council ultimately were to decide very significant additional capital spend, partly driven by individual schemes which require match funding, whether it be levelling up, Mumblesea defences, or more general capital spend, there will be a clear ultimate obligation on future taxpayers and revenue budgets to service that. There isn't simply enough in the reserves to just fund it from reserves over the longer term. So that's the reason why, as an officer, I'm laying an appropriate trail in terms of officer advice in reports, indicating that whilst you can do that in the short term, and that very much fits with my treasury management strategy of not going out and externalizing any more debt until I have to. I mean, we timed it well last time to get rates at under 2%. I don't think in the medium term we're likely to go anywhere near back down to that level. But it's certainly my intention to sit on my hands for as absolutely long as possible, and that will see cash balances being eaten into. It will potentially see some of these reserves being eaten into to buy time and see if we do come back to a more stable position on overall levels of inflation and overall levels of interest rates. But it's not a sustainable solution to just spend the reserves. It's a valid point to make in the short term, and I agree wholeheartedly with it in terms of buying time to see what happens in the money markets and financial markets, and what happens ultimately with the global economy and the UK economy. At the moment, inflation is at relatively heightened levels. Interest rates are at relatively heightened levels to what we've been used to. So for inflation for 40 years, interest rates for the past decade, but clearly they're nowhere near what they used to be. But you're right. It's a valid point, and to some extent, it's part of what I am doing. But the advice I have to give to all members is ultimately spending reserves is not a panacea for solving capital spend or revenue spend. You kind of all know that, but I do accept the point you're making, Chair, that in the short term, it is a very useful strategy to protect the council from being forced otherwise into a position of having to borrow at rates that it would prefer not to borrow at. That is one of the benefits of having that capital equalisation reserve and having very large cash-backed revenue reserves. It's part of the reason why I am able to sleep at night. Can you imagine the conversation if we hadn't added £100 million to reserves over the last 3 years and not actually had that capital equalisation reserve and built it up? They are very valuable safety nets and very valuable time buyers for this authority. Not all authorities have the same luxury of level of reserves as we do in Wales, and certainly not across the border in England.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. Any further questions, Jeff?
Yeah, I got one. Sorry, I just noticed this. 3.7, you actually got a statement actually saying that it is the opinion of the Section 151 officer that the current council needs to continue to prepare for significant change in service delivery that will inevitably impact on direct employment levels going forward. You mentioned time in your last statement. If all these budget changes actually come in, you know, there's quite a large pay rise and we don't actually get the proper funding. What sort of time aspect are we talking about there?
So again, the position we're in, and I feel great sympathy to members, because the reality is we're not going to know 3/4 of our entire budget until we get to the 14th of December with an announcement from Welsh Government, and Welsh Government isn't going to know until sometime after the autumn budget statement on the 17th of November. My reading of the rooms is no different to anyone else. The indications are that, I go back to what I said actually in council. In nominal terms, a 9% uplift in revenue support grant for this year was phenomenal. In real terms, utterly surreal, because it was worth nothing. With inflation now having gone where it's gone, it's worth less than nothing in real terms. There is not one authority in Wales or the UK that is not currently making assumptions and planning as officers for many of these decisions and implications will hit with effect from the 23-24 budget year. So I can't go into details because it's speculation at this point, given we don't know 3/4 of our overall spending power. But if any of the indications come to pass in any way, shape or form, that will be as soon as 23-24. A couple of years ago in council, I indicated that as a result of COVID and the hundreds of billions of pounds being rightly spent at the time, that it would be paid for at some point in time. I think I said expect service cuts and tax rises by the middle of the decade. I think they're just going to come a bit earlier, and I consider that statement in 2.7 to be a statement of fact that everyone is facing, albeit not certain till we get what's announced by the UK government and what is announced by the Welsh government. But it is undoubtedly the case that all public sector services, as are all businesses, UK PLC is under the cosh with increased interest rates and raised levels of inflation. And put simply, you know, we've got an indicative settlement, which means local government was to expect 3% for next year and 2% the year after. It does not take a genius to work out that if you've got pay awards worth 7 or 8%, inflation north of 10%, borrowing costs having doubled or trebled over the last few months, it doesn't take a genius to work out that 3% in cash followed by 2% in cash isn't going to go very, very far. And my view is it means some of the pain, inevitable pain, and what is euphemistically called difficult choices will land at council this coming March. There's no doubt in my mind. The degree of the severity, the degree of the significance, and the amount of pain that can be deferred, given the relatively strong cash balances and the prudent choices that council has taken in the past, will be up for debate. But it is inevitable. 23-24 looks relatively bleak for all authorities, for public sector generally. And there is a reason why every trade body going, every local government association going, and individual leaders and councils are raising those warning shots. Probably stop there because that sounds very, very bleak, and it is. But it is the most likely scenario at this point in time. So the short answer is some of this will hit in 23-24. We are better protected than many authorities given the level of reserves, but no one is immune given where we think the trajectory is likely to be. And I don't know of any economist or any accountant or any treasurer or any council that thinks differently at this point in time, I'm afraid. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. No other questions? If that's the case, can I thank you, Ben, for your report, as usual, very succinct and to the point. So I think, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Chair.
Right, the next item on the agenda is the annual review of performance, Mr. Richard Rowlands, but I welcome Councillor David Hopkins, a Cabinet member and Deputy Leader, who will give us an insight into that.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. What I would say, this is obviously a very backward-looking report. It's just looking historically at where we were. And just put into content, this deals with when we were in the mix of the pandemic and when we had the most risk, particularly in employment and in staff sicknesses. You know, but when you look at what we've got through and where we've been, and shows our strength and where we've worked really together, and shows our greatest asset is our staff and working our way forward. It is what I would say a very brief summary, but when you look at the content of the report itself, it's in excess of 71,000 words. So it's a very, very in-depth look at where we've been. I think it got some concerns throughout it, but I think it paints a very good picture for where we were during the time of the pandemic. And we still carry some of them risks today, particularly in staff and sickness. But if you look at where our staff were working, the conditions they were working in, particularly in refuge and particularly in on the front face, particularly in social care, then all I would say, it was all hands on deck. And I think I very, very congratulate our staff throughout the authority, because everybody that worked throughout the authority, and many people work from home, but more and more people worked on the coalface. So to me, I'm very proud that we've got through that, and we've come out of it in. And I think this report highlights where we've been and where, you know, looks at some of the things that we've done and what we're going to do forward. So more than happy to take it over to Richard to give more of a comprehensive, in-depth look at the report. But I also would like to put on record my thanks to Richard for the work he's put into this and look at a very in-depth report. So thanks, Richard. Would you like to take over?
Okay, thank you,
Thank you.
Councillor.
Over to you then, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Thank you, Chair. Yes, so the report starts on page 32 of your papers, introduces the annual review of performance. As Councillor Hopkins said, the annual review performance is a retrospective annual report. So it covers the previous financial year, 2021-2022. And it's a report that's a requirement of two pieces of Welsh Government legislation. Firstly, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires us to produce an annual wellbeing report where we describe how we've worked sustainably to maximise our contribution to the national goals by meeting the steps in our corporate plan to deliver our corporate priorities. And then secondly, we have Part 6 of the Local Government and Elections Act 2021, which requires us to produce an annual self-assessment describing how we're exercising our functions, using our resources, and governing ourselves. So the annual review performance is a report that meets both of those annual reporting duties. Looking at the report and paragraph 2, which starts on page 33, the content of the annual review is split into 3 parts. So first of all, part 1 of the review is an assessment of the progress that the council has made, meeting the steps in the corporate plan as we work towards meeting each corporate priority. And in that sense, it also provides a self-assessment on the extent to which the council is exercising its functions effectively. In other words, are we making progress to meet the steps to deliver our corporate plan, and are we doing so in a sustainable way and in a way in which we're contributing to the national goals? So that's assessed using criteria which has been developed by the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner, which you can see in paragraph 2.1.3 on pages 33 and 34, and that's with reference to evidence, including case studies, which are used throughout the review to try and help illustrate impact. Looking at paragraph 2.2 on the report on page 34, we can see that part 2 of the review is about assessing the use of resources by the council in the areas which are set out in paragraph 2.2.2 on page 35 by looking at the arrangements which are in place and assessing their effectiveness using the criteria which you can see in paragraph 2.2.4. And then finally in paragraph 2.3 on page 35, we have part 3 of the review described, where it's an assessment of the effectiveness of the council's governance arrangements as set out in paragraph 2.3.4 on page 36, using the same assessment criteria that was applied in part 2 of the review. And then each of the 3 parts of the annual review performance concludes with an assessment made against the criteria, and as part of that identifies continued areas for improvement. Just then quickly on page 39, we have the executive summary. The findings from part 1 of the annual review performance are on pages 43 to 46. The conclusions to part 2 are on pages 48 to 49. And then the findings to part 3 are on pages 50 and 51. And then on page 52, we have the start of the full document. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Richard. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's a huge amount of work. It's given us a good insight, really, into what's actually happened. Even though you're involved in certain projects, it's given you quite a lot of information. I must admit, I've been involved in the city deal quite a lot. And I hope it's a success and so on. You actually mentioned measurements, though. It's actually saying that it'll create 600 jobs here or 10,000 jobs there and so on. What sort of time aspect do you actually measure these targets, if I can call them? Is this an ongoing thing, you know what I mean? Or is it in 10 years' time? We hope to achieve that or will achieve it. How long do you actually keep on measuring these goals?
Yeah, so it's different for different aspects of the report, different for different priorities. So each individual priority will have targets and outcomes which have to be achieved over varying timelines. But the wellbeing objectives or the priorities that the council sets itself, they're usually for the period of the corporate plan. So corporate plans are normally for a 5-year period. But the objectives or the priorities that the council has set itself tend to be ongoing. So we're always going to be safeguarding vulnerable children. We're always going to be looking to improve our economy. What changes are the steps that we put in place to achieve those objectives and the targets that we set ourselves in relation to those steps? And that changes then, for every sort of period in terms of setting the corporate plan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Richard. But I'll find the page now. on page 48, which is the effective use of resources, etc. The a couple of interesting pieces in that table on which is under paragraph, which is on page 48, but under the doesn't give a number, paragraph number, but it's the table that starts on page 48. Areas of continuous improvement. There's a couple of issues there. Response to recommendations by scrutiny, inquiry into procurement, including focus enhance social value. I can't, you know, we did do a scrutiny on it, and it effectively was one of the better outcomes we had out of the scrutiny out of our scrutiny function. I'd be interested to find out what people thought about that and the procurement activity, because I thought we would have had a better report than that, to be perfectly honest. The other one is on asset management, which I know that the Councillor David Hopkin and myself have had a discussion about, and the enhancement of that. So those two issues, I think it's nice to see that they on about continuing improvement, but I thought we'd done quite a bit on procurement, and I thought we'd done reasonably well on it. But on asset management, I agree, we need to continue doing that. There is one other thing, and that's the workforce planning. I thought that the issues on workforce planning actually would have had far more paperwork, but far more involvement than what is down there. Just that one key message for engagement exercises and seek to improve the number of responses to staff survey. I thought there'd have been a bit more in that. I thought we'd have had, you know, a method by which we could have improved the responses from staff. So I think that's something that we need to look at for the future, because it is incredibly important going forward. We've heard what Mr. Ben Smith said about future, you know, revenue and what the possible position we're going to be in with staff, etc. So I think those two issues are rightly that we actually continue with that improvement of the staff survey, and I hope for that sometime in the future we can have a discussion on how we improve that. Thank you, Richard. Mr. Ben Smith.
Thank you, Chair, for calling me back in. It was in relation to the comments you made on procurement, and I think to be fair to officers, I mean that annual review of performance was as at the 31st of March 22. You're quite right in terms of the scrutiny review that's been done and reported through positively to Cabinet. I would assure you, though, that draw your attention to the bit just above that table, which indicates that my overall judgment, where I heavily brought to bear an influence on the assessment, was that there was strong application on those aspects of effective use of resources. So notwithstanding your comments around could it have been better in terms of the wording in the box, I think that's partly a function of time, and we will be much more positive in our feedback as a result of the work that you've done and reported back to Cabinet. But I thought I ought to draw panel's attention to the overall conclusion was that there was a strong use and effective use of resources. And on your second point, you're right. I mean, albeit that's perverse in one sense, isn't it? Because one can have very strong controls and still overspend potentially. You know, I'm in that camp that overall I am confident that we have the processes in place which give me sufficient advance intelligence to be able to give strong, often forthright advice to Cabinet and Council on what the position is. That doesn't in itself obviate that there may be very real pressures to come, but I thought it important that I perhaps come back on that. So the overall assessment was strong use of resources and effective use of resources across those three items, and I don't disagree with you on the asset management one. And there are other authorities where their external auditors are saying there is always work to be done on that one. So I think you're right, Chair, but I think hopefully you take some comfort from the overall assessment, notwithstanding the wording, which was the assessment at the 31st of March before your scrutiny report had gone through Cabinet. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Councillor David Hopkin.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just on the procurement issue, I totally support that, because I think one thing that the scrutiny panel did, working group did identify was the strengths within procurement. you know, we had a very good story when compared to external factors. And everybody keeps talking about the Preston model, and we compare ourselves to them. Our procurement really come out really on top. But there's always room for improvement, and I think the scrutiny panel also identified that and looked at the ambitious plans for us to do more and more locally. And that falls in line with working, you know, better together, achieving more together, and trying to get local businesses upskilled. But that is obviously going to be a challenge going forward. But I do agree. I think we've got a pretty good story within procurement, and we've got the good building blocks to take that forward. I'm quite happy with that position at the moment, but there's always room for improvement, as the scrutiny panel itself identified.
Yeah, we did. You know, the overall performance was good, and obviously the scrutiny function helped with, I think, to identify quite a number of issues in that, and I think that a further ongoing report into that would be welcomed, and I think would welcomed by the whole of the council, apart from anyone else. Okay, if there's nothing else, Richard, any questions? Okay, right. No one else, right? Thank you all very much. Thank you, Richard, very much indeed, and thank you, Councillor David Hopkin.
Okay.
The next item on the agenda is the Welsh Public Library Standards Annual Performance Report. And we can welcome Karen Gibbons and Karen Davis, and Councillor Elliot King is the Cabinet member. And if Councillor King would like to say a few words at the beginning of the report.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a very brief, summary for me. I think mainly to acknowledge the fact that this is a reporting period, 2021. So obviously it covers the pandemic time when obviously there was temporary closure of libraries due to the measures that were in place, and obviously disruption to services. But I think the report is slightly different in how the information's been gathered this year. So much more emphasis on qualitative information. So there's some case studies outlined in the document. So just around how the service met the 12 core entitlements during this time, and then a reduced number of data collection around the quality indicators. And I think, you know, really helpfully, I think the report demonstrates how the libraries adapted during this time to continue to deliver service to residents, and how residents use the service maybe differently, such as, you know, using more of the online information and digital materials, and how some of that has sort of impacted on the ongoing service provision, and how that's changed. And again, I think, you know, paying tribute to staff in the library service who were able to adapt and deliver this to residents, and adapt to the changing circumstances, you know, when libraries were able to reopen. So that's all I wanted to say in terms of introduction. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor King. I think Karen Gibbons, is it? Would you like to take the report?
Hello, hi, I'm Karen Gibbons. I'm the Library Service Manager. Thank you. Yes, so thank you, Councillor King. I think you've described a lot of what I was going to say anyway. So every year the Welsh Government expect us to send a report to them about the performance of the library service, and this is underpinned by the Welsh Public Libraries Framework, which is currently being extended. It's connected and ambitious libraries, but currently the new one is being developed as we speak. So this one's been extended temporarily to cover this particular period. So what this does is ensures that local authorities meet the obligations of the Public Libraries Act and ensure that there is a comprehensive and efficient public library service being delivered locally. So we gather this information for those purposes. So for this period, which is the 2021 COVID period, as we just noted, we delivered services during that period, but we delivered a reduced and different service. So the report sort of demonstrates that. It comes back, it's presented slightly differently in, it was a sort of a generic response. That if you read the report, which is I think Annex A, kind of gives a very general overview of how public libraries throughout Wales demonstrated their impact during the period. And I just wanted to point out on point 1.4, so in 2021 across Wales, 1.5 million books were issued, 173,000 click and collect collections were made across Wales. 4.5 million people still visited the library websites. We really enhanced our online provision during this time. And libraries, local authorities spent £37.5 million on libraries, which is just over 21.2 pence per week per person. I just wanted to bring that up because we are cheap libraries. We do a lot for very little, and I think it's quite important to recognise that. You know, we're quite a frugal service and deliver quite a lot for what we spend. So the report goes on to highlight the role libraries play in ensuring that information and culture is accessible to all. There were some new measures introduced during this time. So we suspended library fines because we automatically renew books. We expanded our online provision, and we were supported by the Welsh Government with a £500,000 investment in e-book titles. And that led to a huge increase in e-book use across Wales and in Swansea as well. We created new digital content. We redeployed many of our staff to many of the measures which are taking place in Swansea to support people shielding. So our colleague Bethan ran the contact centre desk for shielding residents in Swansea. Some of our staff worked on that contact centre desk, and lots of them helped in lots of different ways. So we didn't have our full contingent of staffing either. We created lots of virtual tours for libraries to support the reopening of libraries. And also one of our managers was seconded to the Estyn Athlon project, which helps create more content across Wales about libraries. So just to move on to number 2, the briefing. So I just want to point out that we met all of the 12 core entitlements even during this time. So that was quite good. So we were able to demonstrate that. The report recognised that we have the second highest number of active borrowers in Wales, which we should have because we're the second biggest authority in Wales. So that's good that we are meeting those targets. We did want to point out that the report does go on to say that we have seen a reduction in some of our borrower numbers, but we believe that's because we kind of lost contact with some of our new babies that were being born during this time, and people weren't coming into libraries. So we're picking that up in the years since to try and address those issues. We were closed from April to June, so we spent less on books. So we took a reduction of 25% in our spend on books during that time because we were closed. We supported children through book banding schemes and book bags that they could collect from their libraries from the doorstep instead. Staffing levels were static during this period, but Swansea remains in the bottom quartile in libraries for qualified staff. And this is something which is picked up annually whenever we submit this report. And it's a challenge which we continue to try and address, but budgets will usually dictate whether or not we're in a position to do anything about that. During the lockdown period, many of our residents turned to e-book and e-audio services, and we had a 63% increase in use of e-audiobook services. We're seeing that going away back to physical book borrowing since. Unless we can keep up with that investment in e-books, we probably won't maintain that figure. Our click and collect service was very well used, and this allowed us to expand some of our home delivery service, which we still have in Swansea. We don't have a mobile library service, but we have a home delivery service in Swansea. So we will take recommendations from individuals, from residents who are unable to attend a library because of physical issues, isolation, geography, and we are able to provide a service which we deliver to their doorstep. So that continued throughout this period of 2020-21. So I think one of the conclusions I wanted to draw your point in 3.1 was that one thing that libraries did, which was essential during this time, is provided access to free broadband and Wi-Fi in public libraries. So even though we had to go through lots of measures to reopen our sites during the period from June, July, August, September, we did try and get access to people, because without access to any broadband, people were not hearing the announcements that were in the press and in the media, and we were having handwritten letters from our residents posted into the civic centre saying, when can we have access to PCs, because we don't know what's going on in the world. So that was quite an important facility which we were able to reinstate quite promptly in Swansea. So that's basically the report, and any questions, any more detail you would have like us to explore with you. I did share the 6 quality indicators that we supplied data for. So if you will have any specific questions around those you'd like us to answer, I'm happy to do so.
Any questions, if anyone's, or any comments? I think I would like to make a few comments, if you don't mind. I think there's a couple of things in here which really do need to be rewarded and celebrated. And I think one of the things is that, you know, the libraries are a very important part of local communities. And during the pandemic, it became pretty obvious that they were, people needed and they wanted to know what was going on. And as you rightly said, if they didn't have internet connections or whatever, they used their libraries. But I think the other thing was that as a part of our social fabric, libraries have become more important as time goes on, and especially, and dare I say it, with a certain age group as well. But I also noticed that the children now are more inclined to go to libraries. I don't understand why. You know, they live on electronic apparatus, which got connections everywhere. But I know some of the children that I'm connected to, they want to go to libraries. I think it's maybe a novelty in the beginning, but it does seem to actually encourage the children to do it. And the one thing I would like to ask, you have in your report, you see you have questions and answer sessions for authors. Are they local authors, or do you do it online, or whatever? And do you encourage any of the local authors as well to be involved?
We do. We have inquiries from local authors as well. The ones that we're talking about in this report were Welsh authors, so they were, and it was organised across Wales, and they were digital. So they were done online, and that record of recordings is still available for people to watch. And every now and then we'll just reshare them because they're talking about books which are still relevant and current. So that they've got a bit of a repository now of author talks which we can bring out when we need to. It's not the same as going to visit, hearing somebody talk in front of you. And I think children essentially like to have an important person in front of them, and they really respond well to that. So that's something for us to do more of in the future.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone?
Yeah,
sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, I share Chris's comments. It is so important, you know, in a community, especially if they've not got any other facilities to actually go. You know, I live in Calais, and Calais is really, really important. And I think it's an excellent library as well. But you must have libraries that, shall we say, perform better than other libraries. Do you actually share best practice, or, you know, or do the managers actually share what actually goes on in that library to, shall we say, help other libraries further down the line, you know?
We record information monthly because we have to record it for WPLS. We then share it amongst each other, and we have about a monthly recording and sharing of data, so we can see what the performance is in each library. Calais is a very good reading library. You know, people borrow loads of books in Calais. Yeah, it's very, very good at that. Whereas Penlan has a lot more people attending events, and less reading, but more attendance of events and visiting for other things. And Morriston uses the PCs, so they've got different people, you know, have different strengths in each libraries. But yes, we do share. We've got a meeting tomorrow where we once or twice a year we try and get all library staff together to share good practice. But yes, that's a constant challenge for us to make sure we learn and we adapt. But yes.
Okay, thanks for that. Another point you've actually got here on page 197 is staffing levels static during the period, but Swansea remains in the bottom quartile in ways for qualified staff. Does that affect performance? You know, what's the importance of that? Excuse my ignorance.
We have very few qualified library staff in Swansea Library Service, and we're quite a low-paid workforce. That's what it allows us to keep our service points open, delivering services. But it does mean that we make a lot of the staff we've got who are in development roles, and I think some of it is attracting qualified staff to the area to work with the salaries that we're able to offer. So sometimes it's about recruitment, and sometimes it's just that we don't have very many qualified posts, so we need to look at whether or not we need to change that in the future, and also look at the way our workforce is structured in the longer term. We're at the moment, we're going through an awful lot since that time, because this was 2020-21. We've had a huge turnover of staff in the last 12 months. People are leaving frontline services, wanting to go work in backroom services. Don't want to work weekends, don't want to work in the evenings, and we're losing people because we're quite low paid as well, and they can earn more working in a bar in Swansea now than they can as a library assistant. So it's that choice people are making. So it's a challenge for us going forward.
So is that a threat? You know what I mean? You know, if that's an ongoing pattern, is that a threat to the library service? That
It could be.
could be.
It could be, yes. So we're all right at the minute. We seem to be, we've managed to kind of go through a bit of a peak, and we seem to have settled again. So I think people at the moment are staying in their jobs because they're afraid of what the future is going to be. So I think we've probably got a bit of time for an extra 12 months to kind of see where things go. But yes. Some of our staff were just above the minimum wage, so £10 pay point. So, you know, we need to keep an eye on that.
Chair, could I just add a little bit of information to that? We, although this recognises qualifications at degree level, really, we have tried to do what we can in the last couple of years to make the best of opportunities that are out there for free funded places. So we have put 3 colleagues through an apprenticeship programme as well, which is a slightly lower level of qualification. So library and archives and information services diplomas, if you like, which they managed to successfully complete, which is quite hard on top of their day job. But there's funding for that nationally. So we did take the opportunity to get 3 people through that this year. So we're trying to grow our own as well, which is something we're trying to, and like Karen says, and I think the report displays that, we're very lucky in Wales to have quite a lot of collaboration across Wales. So the Estyn Athlon project was an example of that, whereby that was actually an unqualified member of staff from Swansea that was taken to manage that project, and gained, you know, experience, qualifications and support from colleagues. My phone, as a result of that. So we tried to, if you like, bolster qualifications in other ways rather than tradition.
Right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Anyone online? No. Can I thank Councillor King and both Karens for coming this morning and giving us a very positive report back. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, let me move on to item 9 on the agenda, which is the Welsh Housing Quality Standard Annual Report. And we have Mr. Dave Merrick here, who's going to give us a presentation with his colleagues. Over to you, Dave. I don't know. It's Andrea, would you like to say a few words in the beginning?
No, thank you, Chair. If I can hand over to Dave to introduce the detail of the report, and perhaps if I can follow his introduction with a few comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dave?
Thank you, Councillor Lewis. Thank you, Chair. We've made a short presentation to highlight the main issues that are contained within the report. So if I can just share the screen. So the introduction to the report, reaching the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. Next slide, it's me, and my role is the lead officer for the planning and the delivery of council house maintenance, which includes the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, just a bit of background, it was introduced by Welsh Government in 2002 to improve social housing within Wales. Guidance was changed in 2008 and it became a statutory requirement in 2014. Local authorities and RSLs were given until the 31st of December 2021 to be able to complete with compliance of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. The information that I'm going to present in this report relates to the statistical information that we sent back to Welsh Government up to the 31st of March 2022. I'm hoping that what is presented within this report highlights how the standards of properties within Swansea have improved as a result of the investment from Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So what is the standard? We need to make sure our houses are in a good state of repair, safe and secure, adequately heated, fuel efficient, well insulated, contain up-to-date kitchens and bathrooms, well managed, located in attractive and safe environments, and trying to meet the specific needs of individuals who reside in properties, particularly people with disabilities, providing adaptations. Compliance is reached when we complete all of those elements of work. Sorry. And when we complete all the elements of work, we then reach compliance. Now, we measure it internally when we've made compliance on individual properties. On our asset management database, we record all the work that we carry out, all the investment that we make, and that then allows us to work out what our future work programs are going to be going into the future. We have 30-year business plans, and we plan our work 30 years ahead effectively. We also have outside consultants who validate the information that we produce in terms of compliance, and we have condition surveys every 5 years, and up until now the consultants have agreed and validated the information that we provide in terms of our property conditions. Now, it's not always possible to bring properties up to the Welsh Housing Quality Standard, and that's recognised within the guidance by Welsh Government. And where we can't bring properties up to the standard, it's known as an acceptable fail. An acceptable fail could be for reason of tenant choice, physical constraint, the cost to remedy the issue, or the programme timing when you deliver the actual work. I think it's important to highlight that if we've got a property that falls in an acceptable fail category, we still maintain those properties to make sure that they're fit and they're safe, and they're decent for people to reside in. They simply aren't technically compliant under the terms of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So we report compliance annually to Welsh Government as a part of our statistical returns. And this year we've identified that 70% of our homes are now fully compliant, which is up 13% from the previous year. And that's an additional 1,818 properties that come into full compliance in this last 12 months. We still have 30% acceptable fails, 15% of which is due to the resident's choice. And that's mainly for people who have invested in their own home, putting in their own kitchens and bathrooms, and they've declined the opportunity to have a council kitchen or bathroom installed. We do have 15% that's due to programme planning, and these are pipeline schemes that we've got that may be in planning, in design, procurement, or actually on site being delivered, but they're not compliant because until we have completion certificates, we don't deem them to be compliant properties. Now, there's going to be the next slide is going to show a table of the compliance, and a lot of them will be very high in terms of achievement. So the first 3, you'll see that there's 100% compliance for windows, roofing 99%, doors 99%. Where we do reduce in terms of the amount of compliance is around kitchens and bathrooms, but particularly gardens, where we've still got ongoing programs to improve gardens and make them more attractive and usable for residents. In terms of overall investment, we as an authority have spent £546 million on our properties. 381 million of that sum is HRA contributions, so that's come from tenants' own rental accounts.
and the balance of £165 million is from Welsh Government via the MRA subsidy that they provided to us, which is about £9.2 million a year. That's a 30% contribution to our overall programme, and it highlights the importance of Welsh Government levering in that MRA subsidy. The table below then breaks up into the various elements where the money has been spent. So the biggest spend is against good state of repair, and that's really a lot of the work around external enveloping and repairs of property. So putting new roofs, new rainwater goods, new weatherboards, render, windows, doors. Those are external elements. That's where the bulk of the spend has been. But Safe and Secure has had almost £70 million invested, adequate heating, put in modern boilers and fuel efficient boilers in, and we also insulation wise, we've been upgrading attic spaces with more insulation. But most significantly, as a part of our re-rendering schemes, we put insulated render, which reduces heat loss through walls, and so retains people's heating more readily. Nearly £150 million spent on kitchens and bathrooms, and over £50 million on adaptations over the last 18 years. So in terms of who's been delivering the work, well, there's two main lead organisations. That's housing. We do all the programme planning, the enabling, and the tenant liaison. And building services provide all our technical input in terms of design, procurement, and the delivery of the work. As two services, we work very, very closely together to ensure the programmes are delivered on an annual basis. It's not just those two departments, it's been a corporate effort to achieve the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. And so I think it's worth noting that highways engineers, parks, landscape architects, occupational therapists, legal and finance have all had a role to play in the programme delivery. Welsh Housing Quality Standards had a massive impact, economic impact in the locality, particularly in the building economy, the merchant supply chains that go into that. And also that's given contractors opportunities to grow their businesses locally as well. We got 2 points of delivery. We got our in-house service, building services, who have delivered a lot of the work for us, and in delivering the programme, they've employed 60 apprentices, added 80 additional fully qualified trades to an existing staff of 300. So that shows the impact of that investment in terms of growing our internal contractor. Externally, we procure contractors through Sell to Wales, which is the national procurement framework, to ensure that we keep the contractors that we engage as local contractors to South West Wales wherever we can. And within the contracts that we draw up, we have social clauses to ensure that they have obligations in terms of training and keeping jobs to local, recruiting local labour. That's measured by our bricks and mortar team, and they've recorded 89 full-time jobs and 46 apprenticeships have been created as a part of our programme. There have been multiple other training and work experience opportunities created for local people as a part of the programme. Although the Welsh Housing Quality Standard is about homes, what we're doing is deliver improvements for our residents. And what we've tried to do as a part of this programme is make it very customer focused. And in doing so, we've created a home improvement team that actually acts as a liaison team between residents, the builders, architects, and other technical members of the delivery teams. So any issues a resident may have, they will contact their designated housing improvement officer. The officers have virtually knocked every single door in our stock to engage with residents and try and outline what stream of works we're looking to deliver, how it's going to affect them, timescales, and how it may impinge on their day-to-day lives while the work is being carried out. We also communicate regularly with tenants via our magazine Open House, and every edition that goes out has some reference to Welsh Housing Quality Standard, streams of work, completed work, and general information. So we engage via that magazine as well. We've also engaged with residents in terms of questionnaires. One that we do on behalf of Welsh Government, STAR survey. 75% of residents expressed a positive opinion about the local authority, 14% didn't express an opinion, and we got about 11% who had some level of dissatisfaction. We do our in-house surveys as well, and for our kitchen and bathroom work stream, we have satisfaction levels of 92% by residents who view that the improvements that we've carried out has improved their home and their quality of life. And something in the order of 72% have said the delivery of the work was either good or excellent. So we feel that our residents are happy with the work and the investment the council has put into their homes. Looking to the future, Welsh Housing Quality Standard in its current format will remain a legal requirement, and we will have ongoing programs to meet the current standards. So what we'll see over the next few years is a steady increase in the compliance levels and hopefully a reduction in the acceptable fails. We will continue reporting to Scrutiny the level of compliance going forward, but it's an opportunity for us to also tell you about the future of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. It's going to change radically, and Welsh Government's policy objectives are such that they're going to build on the foundation of the existing Welsh Housing Quality Standard, but their new standard that they're going to introduce on the 1st of April 2023 is going to be hugely different, and it will place much greater burdens on the local authority and other social housing providers to improve houses even further. The main issues are going to relate around decarbonisation of properties, but there will also be other requirements in relation to water management and fire safety measures, property safety measures, and a whole raft of other measures that they're going to introduce. Now, the introduction of the decarbonisation programme is going to test all of us in terms of our future delivery, the skills and qualifications that we've got. We're going to have all these new technologies that we're going to have to train people up to be able to deliver the future decarbonisation programmes on our behalf. What this is going to mean is going to be a major financial challenge for the local authority, and we've done some high-level estimates, and we think that the programme will cost us something in the region of £875 million to deliver the new standard as we understand it to be, and that's probably twice as much money as we've got in our 30-year business plan for the existing Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So there's going to be major challenges for all social housing providers post 1st of April 2023. So in summary, this is a major milestone and achievement that we've achieved the Welsh Housing Quality Standard with a huge amount of investment, £546 million in the city and county of Swansea. The delivery has met the policy objectives of Welsh Government, but it's also met the policy objectives
of our corporate Swansea requirements as well, in terms of improving people's homes. There's been a real positive impact to the local building economy, the supply chain, and also for providing training for young people in our community. It's also had a very positive benefit to tenants in terms of having more secure homes, warmer homes, homes in better state of repair, all of which will contribute to having better health gains for residents. So we've got 70% compliance, full compliance, the remainder acceptable fail, and we see us adding to that 70% in the forthcoming years. And we will come back to council, to scrutiny, to outline the ongoing programme, and we'll also start to report on the new standard, the Welsh Housing Quality Standard 2023, that will be introduced next year. So that's the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dave, for a very comprehensive and enlightening report, I may add. Where's Andrea? Oh, there she is. Would you like to say a few words, Andrea?
Yes, thank you.
Councillor,
Chair.
sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Chair. And as you rightly say, Dave gave a very comprehensive update as to our current position. It would be remiss of me not to add my thanks to Dave, his team, building services, and the other associated departments. It's been very much a cross-departmental approach to this. Dave has outlined very articulately the benefits that have been for our council tenants, but also for apprenticeships in terms of upskilling and training, and that will help us in the long term to meet those trade skills gaps that we know that are there. And obviously he has outlined the challenge that we will be facing as of next year, where we're looking to decarbonise council homes. It is a huge investment requirement, and we will have to plan very, very carefully in terms of improving our current homes, balancing that against building and acquiring new homes to address the homelessness challenges. And at the same time, with the same pot of money, trying to decarbonise our homes as well. So it is going to be very much a challenge. We are communicating this strongly with Welsh Government. We will rise to the challenge, but obviously additional resource would be very welcomed, because this comes with an extremely high price tag, which in the current business plan is going to be very difficult for us to achieve. But that's notwithstanding, the Welsh Housing Quality Standard investment. I'm extremely proud of the record we have to date, and of the work that has been carried out across the estates. The feedback from tenants has been hugely positive, and we will continue to meet with those acceptable fails, those people who might not want us to go into their home and to renew kitchens and bathrooms. We have to respect tenants' choice, of course, as we've said to scrutiny meetings in the past. But once the property does become available, we are using every opportunity to upgrade our voids, and we will continue to do that on a regular basis as well as part of the ongoing programme. So I'll leave it there, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions, but I hope that members today will recognise the significant investment and improvement that we've put into our housing for the benefit of our council tenants to upgrade their homes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andrea. I have Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I lost connection halfway through Andrea's comments there. So if I'm repeating some which she's already answered, that's my apologies for that. First of all, can I just reflect the thanks to all the officers of the Housing Department for the work that's been done in achieving the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. As a ward councillor, I've come across it obviously on a day-to-day basis with my constituents and the tenants in my ward, and the work is outstanding, and the effort that's been put into this is huge, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I know I was a local government minister when the Welsh Housing Quality Standard was first introduced back in the early 2000s, and obviously it was extended. It's very ambitious, and I think I'm just pleased that we're able to do that whilst retaining the stock which we have, which didn't appear possible 10 years ago when the first target year was met. So I think that needs to be acknowledged by the committee. So I'm losing. All right. So my screen just changed, soon because we just lost the thing. I was going to ask. Now the Welsh Housing Quality Standards has been effectively met, how we were going to change the balance of our capital spending. But then I heard Dave's comments in terms of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard 2023, and clearly we do need to be building more council houses. My question really is, has the Welsh Government given any indication of the sort of target dates by which they wish to achieve this decarbonised target that with huge costs from what I can see? The initial, obviously, when the Welsh Housing Quality System was first brought in, it was a 10-year period, then it was extended for a further 10 years. Are they looking at similar sort of timescales?
Dave?
Thank you, Chair. They have issued a document for consultation, and they've indicated in that consultative document that it's going to be a 10-year period to meet the new standard. Now, I think all social housing providers in Wales have responded in that consultation exercise to say it's simply not deliverable in that timescale. And we've also highlighted that financing the programme is also going to be incredibly difficult unless there's significant amounts of public money brought in to be able to help us to deliver these programmes. We await their any revisions that they make to the consultation document. We're due to find that out in January or February. I don't know for certain. My personal view is that we may see the period of the Welsh Housing Quality Standard 2023 extended from 10 years to 15. But that's only a personal hunch I've got on the basis of the original Welsh Housing Quality Standard that was introduced in 2002 to be completed by 2012. But then very quietly in 2011, they extended it up to 2020 and then subsequently to 2021. So I think there is a possibility that the 10-year programme that they've initially set out will be extended because it simply won't be deliverable within a 10-year period.
It just seems to me, Chair, that the Welsh Government are talking about 20,000 new social houses within a 5-year period, and now they're talking about nearly £900 million worth of investment over a 10-year period. That it sort of belies their other comments about the money being available to the Welsh Government and to local government, and it doesn't seem to be in the same reality sector as the rest of us. Anyway, that's just my view.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Black. Councillor Paxton-Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. 2 points, I think. First of all, a very quick question, and to say thank you very much for the report because it is very interesting, I must admit, and the figures are impressive, and there's no doubt in that. But firstly, do we ever transfer properties from our housing stock to social housing companies or organisations?
Councillor, no, we don't. In fact, we're buying properties back that we've previously sold under the right to buy legislation, and we are starting to purchase some of those properties back as a part of our acquisitions programme.
Okay, it's just something I heard the other day which raised my interest in that one, but I'm glad you satisfied me on that. And there's extra £875 million for decarbonisation.
Well, it's that figure is a high-level review of what we think the likely cost of the programme, the whole programme. So that's the existing Welsh Housing Quality Standard, plus the extra requirement of the decarbonisation programme, plus fire safety and building safety, and the plethora of other additional requirements that are going to be overlaid as a part of the new standard. That's where we think that we're going to be at. We have just put some high level estimates together to try and get some sort of idea the size of the future programs, just to get some sort of context to it. And it is a huge sum of money. In our 30-year business plan, we do have about £423 million that we've set aside for the current Welsh Housing Quality Standard, but we will have a massive shortfall to deliver the requirements of the new standard.
Sorry, just to put that into another way for me to understand. Does that mean effectively by the time we finish this project at that stage, we will have invested approximately £100,000 per property? Is that the sort of figure that we're looking at?
It's not necessarily true.
I would say we would probably be coming towards 100,000 between the original Welsh Housing Quality Standard and the revised one. We'll be looking at an investment of around about £100,000 per property. We haven't worked out exactly what it means per property, but certainly when we're trying to build up estimates for certain house types that are difficult to treat, so they would be non-traditional system-built properties, we are coming to figures certainly in the £100,000 to do full refurbishment schemes.
How do we see the impact on that on tenancy rentals and what have you?
My understanding is that rents are still going to be regulated by virtue of inflation plus 1 or 2%. So the additional investment isn't necessarily going to be mirrored in increased rents to tenants, as I understand it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paxton. Andrea, do you want to say anything? I got a couple of, if I can interrupt, there is a couple of things I'd like to ask Dave to clarify, because one of the things that people might watch this on YouTube or whatever they do, I don't know, or be reported, is that straight away the public will think that the council and their council tax is going to be paying, out the hundreds of millions of pounds this is necessary. I'd like it confirmed that this money, the Welsh Quality Housing Standard, has been achieved by, number one, a grant from the Welsh Government since 2002, which was, I can't remember the figures exactly, but then the rest of the money is through borrowing, and that money's paid for about the housing revenue account, which is an account which is ring-fenced purely and simply for council housing.
Yeah, perhaps if I can come in on that, Chair. It is a very important point that you raise in terms of how we communicate to the public, because it is often and frequently misunderstood how the investment in our council housing is managed. And it is, the majority of it is through council rents. And as you say, Welsh Government funding, this does not get funded through council tax. And so I think it is important that you raise that point. We have started, you may well notice in our press releases, anything to do with any investment on any of our sites, we've started adding this is fully funded by council rents, just to try and keep clarifying that point, because as you say, it's frequently misunderstood and misinterpreted.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you're right. I think it's incredibly important that the public understand that. I also think there's a number of other issues where social housing, public housing, whatever you want to call it, but is incredibly important, because, as I said earlier on, speaking to Dave, that one of the greatest improvement, if not the greatest improvement in public health, has been since 1910 the introduction of council housing or public housing. Because prior to that, the slums that we had in the UK were appalling, and thankfully we've come to a position now where right throughout the UK we are having better quality housing in social housing and in public housing. The costs of the new standard that will come in, I'm assuming that any new standard is going to come in is similar to a new build in the private sector, and that is it has to have fire sprinklers in it, and retrospective fitting of fire sprinklers got to be one of the most expensive things that you actually do, because they are incredibly expensive to fit. And I know that my daughter's bought a new house and that's already been fitted with them. So I'm assuming that that's part and parcel of what the new housing quality standard will introduce. And also about fire suppressants, learning the dreadful mistakes that were made with Grenfell and about cladding, that I'm assuming that this new quality standard that will be introduced in 2024 will have that encompassed in it as well.
Perhaps if I can come in for the first part of your question, and I'm sure Dave can outline, because part of our ongoing future investment will be fire precaution measures, and Dave can perhaps expand on what that actually means. But in terms of the cost of sprinkler system installations, we have to a point safeguarded ourselves in terms of training teams in-house to deliver the sprinkler systems, because you can imagine it is an industry in high demand, and that is likely to increase further as well in terms of fire precautions. So we have safeguarded ourselves to some effect by having a trained in-house specialist team, and we've used that team to install the fire sprinkler systems in our high-rise blocks, which has been a really good investment and very positive, and we will continue to utilise that. Dave, I don't know if you want to come in to expand a bit further on the fire precaution measures we're likely to see.
Can I just pick up on the fire sprinklers first of all? We've certainly installed them in all our high-rise properties, as Councillor Lewis mentioned. We also have them in our sheltered housing complexes as well. We'll be fitting them as part of our new build programme, but the consultation document for Welsh Housing Quality 2023 retrospectively installing sprinkler systems into ordinary domestic dwellings isn't a requirement. So we won't be rolling that particular programme out while we've got duties relating to decarbonisation and other measures. In terms of the fire requirements, there'll be more flats that we will now have a duty to assess risk on. And I believe the number of inspections, and forgive me, I'm doing this off the top of my head, it's going to increase something in the order of tenfold to our existing level of duty. So there will be virtually all flats will be having risk assessments carried out to ensure that they don't present a fire risk in any respect.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any other further questions or comments? If not, can I thank you, Andrea? Can I thank you, Dave, and thank you, colleagues, as well, because I think it's incredibly important, and I look forward to coming back and telling us more about it. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
On the work plan, there will be some changes to the work plan, not so much for the 6th of December, but there will be other changes as well, because one of the we may have a look at a further request about looking at the medium-term budget statement. But when we know, we'll let everybody know. But in the meantime, can I thank you all for attending, and keep dry.